welcome to the live stream of Iteration Office Hours. We're trying to help collectively think through how we can break things down. Iteration is one of the 6 core values at GitLab, and it's the toughest one. And Shangzhen, you have the first one. Thanks for that. You want to verbalize a bit what
yes,
process is?
Yeah. So in one of our retrospective that one of our team members mentioned, there was a task that slipped from the release. When looking at it, I think one of the reasons is because of the context switch, because suddenly their high priority task came in, and our team members had to switch to the higher priority tasks, and left some issues in the middle, and that's why it was slipped from that release. I'd like to get some opinion or your insight on how do we handle breaking down issues or take an iterative approach while there may be some context switching in the process.
Yeah, I think the idea is to break down things as much as possible. And if the tasks are smaller, you're less likely to get interrupted. In this case, I don't see how this task could have been made smaller, and I don't see how the S1 issue really looks like an urgent issue. So I think what happened here. I think in general, what we're trying to do by making things smaller is to reduce the chance that you get interrupted. And if you work on a 3-week task, the chances that it will get interrupted is 3 times greater than if you run on a 1-week task. Same for any site. So that's why we try to make tasks smaller. Then the chance of every individual task getting interrupted is smaller. Okay. And also, if it's smaller, it's quicker to spool back up after you switch the context. There's less context if for smaller tasks.
Okay.
And also, S1 might not be the situation where you kind of just go and drop everything on the floor if you're close by. There is something to be said about if you correctly scope down the issue, you can give a good estimate of when it's going to be completed. So if an S1 is actually really an S1 that needs to be handled immediately, you can always ask, how long does it take to wrap up the ongoing issue before you continue further? And if it's scoped properly, you'll wrap it up quickly.
Yeah, but looking at the issue, it seemed pretty urgent. So that's S1 is S1, otherwise it should have been an S2. Cool.
Okay, thank you.
But I agree, like if you have the chance, just talk with the person requesting. Matt, you have the next one. Thanks for putting something on. You want to verbalize it?
Sure. Yep. So my question is partly about the actual feature, but more about the process we took in breaking it down. In our work with the metrics dashboards, we wanted to add a new feature to allow for annotations. We started with an issue that was just kind of do the work, but change it to be this issue that I've linked here to spike issue to come up with a more iterative approach. So we broke the feature into iterations and then added issues underneath for the implementation, starting with kind of an API approach and then building on. So it's still in progress, but I feel like we took a fairly iterative approach. And some of the team members highlighted it in our retrospective that they liked this. But I want to know if there's feedback on doing this kind of let's plan it out first and break it all down approach of doing that, or as an alternative, just starting with let's do the first thing we know, let's see how that goes, and then figure it out, kind of what the next step is after we do the first iteration.
Yeah.
Would you mind if I?
Yeah, go ahead, Marin.
So the way I'm looking at this issue without actually digging into every single piece is you named first iteration and it has 5 items in there. From there, I don't see how they actually relate to each other, as in I would name the first iteration basic implementation of the CRUD, right? That will give you enough path forward to enable a feature for people to use it in their own way. And then the second iteration would be understanding how they use it, if they're using, and if they're not using it, then you can talk about what is on your roadmap, what do you actually want to accomplish, and that would be your second iteration. So without going into all of this together, I would say the first iteration is actually number one, not first iteration group of 5 things. And then get feedback from that and figure out whether number 3 is even going to come to you in this sequence. It might be in what you're calling now a third iteration as you go on.
No, that makes sense, yeah.
A few remarks, and all the comments we give are not necessarily about the specific example, it's just a way to get our brains working. I think it's super useful to have a vision. How's this going to end up in some time, and think through that. Thinking is much cheaper than faster than programming, so it helps you see around corners. I'm not a big fan of them planning out every iteration. You only have to plan the first thing. I'm pretty sure you're going to have a better opinion about what to do next after the first thing. So it's great to have a vision, but that doesn't mean you plan it all the way up to the vision. You only need the first step. The vision can help you guide there, but you don't need to plan the other steps. So that's a bit weird to me. I understand that when you have that vision, you think like, I'm going to plan everything out to get there. I think that's an anti-pattern. And some of the things here were API first. I think API last is better. And this might be something to even write in our engineering docs. APIs are very hard to change. There are a contract with the people programming towards our interface. So you should build APIs when you have as much information as possible. So after as many iterations as possible, then you expose the API, not at the start, because now you're locked into that design. So I think at GitLab, we should be an API last company, not an API first company, though I know that's much more trendy, but I think our API should be stable, and APIs are hard to change. The last thing was something I noticed, like there was already a plan to kind of deprecate annotations after 2 weeks. I'd be super sad if I made a manual annotation in GitLab and then 2 weeks later it was gone. So maybe that's just for the automated annotations, but it seems a bit like, maybe we could even wait, like how big of a workload are annotations going to be? Is that really needed? It seems like getting ahead of ourselves a bit. Maybe monitor whether they're really getting a problem, starting to be a problem, instead of doing that automatically.
Sid, how do you feel about the fact that the API first is actually for the most basic actions like create, right? Create, destroy, and so on, where there is a very little chance that you won't be doing that to begin with, right? Like you need to create an annotation regardless. So if you do it API first, you've handled the most common use case, and it will provide people a programmatic way to use something and give you feedback to build your own feature, maybe in a different way than you originally wanted. Yeah.
Well, you're making decisions, not just that you can create an annotation, but also how you can create it. What data do you need to send? And it could be, for example, that in the beginning, you want a color. Suppose you want a color. You make the decision like, I'm going to do colors in RGB. But you talk with people, and it turns out that if you do it in RGB, it doesn't work with if people change color schemes. So instead, you should just not have colors there, or you should say attention color or more subdued color or something like that. As soon as you make the API, you're kind of locked into that, and it's a bigger thing to change it. So,
but to me, that is the second and third iteration, thinking about color. To me, the first iteration is you want to create an annotation in just one way, which is, let's say, a single color, and you add it to a specific timestamp, and that's it.
Yeah, you timestamp and a name, and then the name is small, that's displayed. Do you also do a hover over?
No, because that's not the first iteration. That's the second or third iteration.
An API locks you into every decision you make, and If you need the API to make the front end, I can see it. But if the APIs that immediately make it sound like it's a contract with the outside world, you're gonna, even if you do a timestamp, you're gonna lock in onto like how many milliseconds you accept in the timestamp. Like the examples are just for illustrations, probably not true, but it locks you in. So I'd be hesitant to have an external contract, because if it's an internal contract where you have both sides of the equation, you can iterate much faster than when it's with an unknown number of external parties, which is an application programming interface.
So one strategy I have seen used, Sid, you can feel free to disagree with this, but one strategy I've seen is the fact that you said CRUD to start with, and you're doing all 4 of those operations. Just doing the create one makes it pretty clear to customers that we're still experimenting with this API, and it kind of gives them a better idea. So if there's absolutely no way to store data, like I thought about, okay, just a front end display where it's temporary, where you can do annotations personally, might be a solution, but it's not, it's ephemeral, right? So like you don't have an API in that situation, but at least gives customers view of it. So if you're up against the clock and you want to give customers visibility, and annotations with no storing of that data would be the way to go. That's non-API first from that perspective, as an example. The other aspect is don't think that you have to do CRUD all 4 operations. Do one, create, and just make sure that you're doing a fast follow with updating the other ones. That's the other idea that I thought about in this particular case. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Sid, if that makes sense. Or
what's the summary of your 2 suggestions?
One, don't do CRUD altogether. An iteration could be one aspect of CRUD. The other one is think in terms of ephemeral features rather than storage to get around the API issue.
Yeah. Those are very valid suggestions.
Yeah, there's also the case of like a lot of the stuff that we're doing now is GraphQL first, which is like our new API. And so we don't want to build it outside of GraphQL and then bring it in. So maybe would it make sense to kind of mark some things as experimental and not officially part of the API?
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. Before I go on a rant about, go ahead, Andrew.
Sorry to interrupt, Sid. I just wanted to ask, is that sort of official policy, or should it be, or is it something that we should sort of, is there a way that we can mark that in our GraphQL API, for example?
I think API last is we could make that a thing. Like don't start off by declaring an official API. And if you make an API, mark it experimental until you're a bit further along. If that's a problem people actually face in practice, where they felt constrained by the API they already declared, because that's an assumption from me. Any opinions on that?
Like, I think that makes sense too, because as you use the API, you discover the problems with it. But obviously, with something like GraphQL, if you're using the Explorer, it might be difficult to know what is sort of the official API and what we're just kind of using to pass information to the front end while we get the API right. And I don't know if we have a way of marking that, or kind of, but generally as a way of iterating, it does make sense to make the API official as the last thing, I think, rather than the first.
Cool.
I have a comment. So it's really, I think it's really going to depend on the type of end user. My experience tells me that enterprise users are way more used to changing APIs. This is why they use versioning and all that. And also they're heavy consumers of API. So to me, it is frustrating to go to a service and not find a way in which I'm doing something enterprise level that I have to go clickety-click. I mean, this is why Windows on the data center, Microsoft had to build an entire API so that people could run these things at scale.
Yeah, when's the last time we updated our API version?
I don't know, but it was a
Couple
while
of years
back
ago.
because it's
A couple of years ago. Still V4. I don't think it's ever going to change from V4. So we are not really versioning our API, so change is hard. So I think maybe instead of saying API last, it should be API experimental first. Like you first mark something as experimental to indicate that it might change. I think that's maybe a better way to achieve it, because I kind of agree. Like it's kind of unfair to not, we frequently need to make the API to make our front end work anyway. And then an undocumented API is like the worst. So
right.
maybe the idea is to just mark the API experimental in the beginning, so you buy yourself some space to change it while you iterate on it.
There's something important here, which we're kind of dancing around, but not really naming, which is APIs are very strategic. And we may need an API to drive our front end, but like Jerry's indicating, enterprise users may have additional or different expectations. And Twitter famously got into they broke the entire web one day when they end of life their V1 API. And the story behind that is they had this culture at the time where anybody kind of ship anything. So a developer just wrote an API. It was built to power their front end. And the moment people saw that API, they looked at it and just jumped to the conclusion of, oh, I could build a Twitter client. So that's what they started doing, right? But Twitter later came to the strategic conclusion of all these Twitter clients are actually detracting from our business. We have to shut it down. And then the API became V2, which was not just a new version of the API, it was the data firehose, right? And that was used by hedge funds to do trading. It was a totally different use case. So I do think we have, like, does an API that is used to power our front end, is that strategic for us? Is it useful for people to build another front end for us, or should we be doing something?
I don't think anybody's doing that. And Twitter encouraged people making other clients. They refer to clients. They put in their web interface what client you were using. So that wasn't an accident that people started building Twitter clients. It was just they got a bit scared when one smart investor started rounding up all the different Twitter clients, was on track to get the majority of the Twitter traffic and threatened to split off into another Twitter that he would name something else. That is when they got super, super concerned. They bought the biggest Twitter client and they started with the Twitter medallions, where you needed a medallion to start a new client. So it wasn't accidental. It was a very strategic move. I don't think we have the same problem with other people doing interfaces. I think our analogy is much more like something like Jenkins, which exposed a ton of APIs to plugins, and it fixed them in place where it's very hard to change the software because you were constrained by so many APIs. And our mission is everyone can contribute. So the most important thing is that the software is malleable, that you can keep changing it. And APIs kind of have this outside constraint. And the more constraints you have, the harder it is to move and keep improving your software. So the more APIs are experimental, the more we can break as we need to change our software. I think that's the bigger picture. Eric, any?
The story I heard was from a Twitter PM who was there. So, but that's just one. It was a big company. So
maybe that's what they would have liked to believe. I think it was.
Or maybe it's the business history. Yeah.
Cool. Let's move on. Michelle, you want to articulate your case?
Yeah, that was a really good conversation. Well, okay, where am I now? Actually, one of the things that Matt said, I think applies to my situation, which is, do we iterate on what we know first? So this issue started off as a front-end issue. They didn't need back-end support. As time went on, they discovered they do need back-end support. When back-end got involved, now we're kind of restarting the investigative stage, and there's a lot of collaboration back and forth. Long story short, it ended up slipping twice when backend did make some changes. And I think that I think both front end and backend iterated well in their merge requests. But when backend did submit the change, that caused more problems. And now we have unknown things that we didn't think about, and kind of that story where it spiraled out of control. So I wanted to get your thoughts on outside of small MRs, how could we have iterated in this case, the collaboration, the unknown problems and things like that?
Yeah, let's dive into it, because this, on the surface, it seems like this super simple issue. I have the same thing, like, oh, this seems simple. Just ask our API to request a file and just show the file. Like, what's hard about this? So what did people run into? What made it hard?
Yeah, I can talk about it.
Okay.
Michelle, if you want. So basically, we noticed that we had the endpoint to get the data from the file, and the full file was used, but it missed one particular aspect, which is the detail of the viewer that we use for the kind of renamed file. So we had an endpoint for the file, but there was missing parts of that endpoint that we totally missed when we were planning. And then when we were building it, we realized that the app needs that viewer to render it. And that required backend changes because we're not on GraphQL there on the merge request.
So I don't understand. What is a viewer?
So the viewer helps the app realize how to properly render the file on the merge request.
Okay.
It gives details on how that should be presented to the UI.
So there was an endpoint missing for like file type.
Not the endpoint. The endpoint was there. It's just properties. Yeah, inside the JSON response, some things were missing. Yeah.
That had to be populated.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Some more light on that. When the backend did populate that data, it was like, oh, actually, we're missing more data on a separate endpoint, and then so that's kind of the unknowns that we discovered along the way.
And was there just thinking, was there a way to kind of display the file ugly or something like that, or just open it in raw? Just offer the customer, instead of saying file moved and displaying it, is saying there's file moved, there's displaying it, but an in-between option is just make it a link that so you can open it in the raw view.
That's a good question. We didn't consider it.
Yeah, there you go. What we did consider from the backend perspective is why do we need to call it a renamed file? Why can't we just display it like we display all files? But that's kind of where the problem lied, because it could be an image, it could be text, it could be different things. We need to handle the diff differently for those scenarios. But obviously linking to a file would have made all of those irrelevant.
Yeah, I think that's the 80-20. Like, the person just wants to see, okay, what happened here? And right now it's like there's no link. It will cost you 2 minutes to find it. Or well, right, that's exaggerating, but just making that easier. So kind of, and that's just kind of, if it's too hard to make, just let's change plan and let's think about what's even easier to make. Cool.
Thanks.
Thanks for asking. Thanks, everyone. We'll do another one of these soon, Sherry, because there's a ton of stuff we didn't get to. So that's super exciting. Thanks, Marin, for co-hosting.